Hello everyone, this is Mr. Wilhelm. Today we're talking about section 2.4, which is congruent supplements and complements. Today we're going to be focusing specifically on four theorems that are going to be able to prove congruent angles. They're really broken down into two similar ones talking about complementary and supplementary. The first one relates to complementary angles. If we have two angles that are complementary to the same angle, so we have 1 and 3 that are both complementary to 2, we know that 1 and 3 must have a relationship because they're complementary to the same angle. Therefore, we can say that those two angles are congruent. In a similar fashion, in the next one, if we're talking about two angles that are complementary to congruent angles, so we have angles 2 and 3 are congruent. We have 2 and 3 mentioned right here as well. Since 1 and 4 are complementary to congruent angles, we can then say that those angles are congruent as well. And this section is about four theorems, so this is two of them. The other two are very similar, just talking about supplementary. So same thing here, we have angle 2 is a supplementary angle to both angles 1 and 3. Therefore, we can say angles 1 and 3 are congruent. And in the next one we have angles 2 and 3, which are congruent, are supplementary to angles 1 and 4. Therefore, we can say that angles 1 and 4 are congruent. And we can apply this to algebra problems as well. In this particular problem, we have PQR is supplementary to QRS, and we have TWZ is also supplementary to QRS. So because those two angles are supplementary to the exact same angle, we can say that angle PQR is congruent to angle TWZ. We can then use that with our algebra here and set up an equation. And then we can solve for x. We can get an x value of 26. Now after we get the x value, we need to make sure that we plug it in. So we can take our x value and plug it in for angle TWZ. And get that angle TWZ is 82 degrees. We then need to double check to answer the question. It says find the measure of QRS. We know that angle QRS is supplementary, so we can find that the measure of angle QRS is 98 degrees. We can also apply those theorems to our proofs. First off, we can start with our given statement that we have angle WXZ congruent to angle VXY. And if we're looking to get to angles 1 and 3, we can see that 1 and 3 are adjacent to the two angles marked, and they are forming a straight angle. So we can use supplementary, but we need to first get to the straight angle. So we have the entire angle WXY is a straight angle, and we can assume that from the diagram. And then we can do the separate angles. First, angle 1. We see that angle 1 is supplementary to the angle VXY. And then we also have angle 3 being supplementary to angle WXZ. So if two angles form a straight angle, we can say that they are supplementary. We can do the same thing what I mentioned with angle 3. Now after we have that, we have two angles, angles 1 and 3, we've mentioned right here, and they are supplementary to angles VXY and WXZ, which we have also mentioned up here. So we have two angles that are supplementary to angles that we've already mentioned congruent. So you can say angles 1 and 3 are congruent because they are supplementary to congruent angles. And moving on, number 3. Start off with our given statement again. You can see angles 1 and 4, looking in the diagram, are going to have a relationship with the angles next to them, angles 2 and 3. So similar, we're going to need to talk about supplementary angles, but first off we are going to need some straight angles. So if we first look at angle ABD, we can say that angle ABD is a straight angle, and we can assume that from the diagram. If we stick with that that statement that we've just said, using that straight angle, we can say that angles 1 and 2 are supplementary, because if two angles form a straight angle, then they are supplementary. And then we can go on to the next straight angle that we have in the other diagram, which is relating angle 3 and angle 4. We first need to mention the straight angle again, so we can again assume that from the diagram, and we can say the pair of angles are supplementary, and it's the same reason that we just mentioned in number 3. Now we have angles 1 and 4 that we mentioned back at the given statement. And we also have angles 1 and 4 mentioned right here. So angle 2 and angle 3, which are angles that are supplementary to the congruent angles that were mentioned at the very beginning, we can say that those two angles are congruent, because if two angles are supplementary, and I screwed up the statement, if two angles are supplementary to congruent angles, then they are congruent. Moving on to the next proof. Again, with these proofs, I think it's important that you start with one of the given statements and then go on with what you can with that statement. So if we look in this proof, we have perpendicular and 90 degrees, and we want to say two angles are congruent. If we start with the first given statement of perpendicular, we can go off of the perpendicular. We know that if two segments are perpendicular, that they are going to intersect to form a right angle. So we can say that angle RTW is a right angle, because if two segments are perpendicular, then they intersect, forming right angles. We also know that in a diagram, if two angles form a right angle, so they are adjacent, forming a right angle, we also know that they are complementary angles. So in the diagram, that would be angles 2 and 3. And if two angles form a right angle, then they are complementary. And then if I look back at the other given statement, I know that if two angles add up to 90 degrees, I can also say that they will be complementary, so I need to bring in the other given statement. And because those two angles equal 90 degrees, they are complementary. Two angles add to 90 degrees, then they are complementary. And now looking at what I want to prove, angles 1 and 3 are congruent. I have angles 1 and 3 mentioned here, and they are both complementary to angle 2. So if two angles are complementary to the same angle, then they are congruent. So I can say angles 1 and 3 are congruent. like you guys complete this proof before you come into class tomorrow. And this concludes section 2.4.